theyeshiva.net.
Okay, the Gemara says that kala oisik b'teiros oila kilu hikriv oila. When you learn the Torah of the carbonel, it's like you're being makriv an oila. So sometimes Pesach finishes, but you still miss Pesach. So when you learn Pesachim, so you're still in Pesach, so you still have the Eir of Pesach. Okay, we are on Kuf Tez Zayin, Amud Aleph, all the way on the top, 3 lines from the top. Kuf Tez Zayin, Amud Aleph. You see Pesachim, Kuf Tez Zayin, Amud Aleph. There's 2 dots, 3 lines from the top. Yeah. The Gemara now addresses a whole new piece. We learned in the Mishnah, the last Mishnah was on Kuf Yud Daled Amud Aleph. And in that Mishnah, the Mishnah told us that in the beginning of the Seder, after you poured and you drank the first cup and you made Kiddush, they bring the vegetable which the person dips and eats, which what we call the karpas. And they also bring, for the person, they bring matzah, they bring morer, chazeres, which is the romaine lettuce, and they bring charoses, and they bring also 2 cooked dishes, which we usually use, the zroya and the beitza, the gargle and the egg. They bring all this to the Seder, which we call today the kairos. You have the zroya and the beitza, is called the shnei tafshilin, and you have the chazeres, which is the morer, and you have, of course, the karpas, and you have the charoses, and you have the matzah. That's basically what we have in the beginning of the meal. That's clear in the Mishnah. And the Mishnah adds, Afal pi she'ein charoses mitzvah. Even though charoses is not a mitzvah, where Rebbe Elazar, Reb Tzadok says, Rebbe Elazar, the son of Tzadok, says that it is a mitzvah. So the Mishnah on Kuf Yud said, even though it's not a mitzvah, we still bring charoses. But Rebbe Elazar, the son of Reb Tzadok, says it is a mitzvah. And then the Mishnah finishes that in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, when there was a Beis HaMikdash, and you were doing the Seder there, they also brought the body of the Karban Pesach. That was the Mishnah on Kuf Yud Amud Aleph. So the Gemara now says, Afal pi she'ein charoses mitzvah. That the Chachamim say, the Tanakama says you bring charoses even though it's not a mitzvah. Frag the Gemara, big question. Ve'i loy mitzvah, if it's not a mitzvah, so then mishumai maisila. Why are they bringing charoses? In other words, what's the point? I understand if it's a mitzvah to bring charoses, for whatever reason, which we'll discuss, you bring it. But if it's not a mitzvah, Rebbe Elazar, the son of Rebbe Tzadok, says it's a mitzvah. But if it's not a mitzvah, why are we bringing charoses? I mean, for that price, you can bring oranges, and you can bring apples, and you can bring grapes. I mean, what's the charoses essentially are fruits. So why are you bringing the charoses? Zog the Gemara, the answer to this is, Reb Ami said, Mishum Kappa. The reason the Tana holds you have to bring charoses is not because of a mitzvah, but because of kappa. Kappa, we learned earlier, according to one interpretation that the Rashbam brings, is, the second interpretation is a worm. First interpretation is that there's some acid or poisonous element in the sap of the lettuce, and the charoses neutralizes that destructive component, that poisonous element. That's why you bring the charoses. It's basically kappa.
Even though there's a reason, it's still not a mitzvah. Once there's a reason, it's
right. So it's not a definition of a mitzvah. It's more for health. It's a hazard. Without it, it's a health hazard, which becomes a mitzvah. Yes. In fact, it becomes in some way stronger. There's an expression, chamira sakanta meisura. Right. We're more concerned with a sakana than with an isur. An isur, there's issues of majority, minority. You go according to the majority of cases. When it comes to sakana, you're always chayshish. Even for a small minority, you always have to be cautious and concerned. But the bottom line here is that it's not. It's the charoses neutralizes it. Okay. Amar Rabasi adds the following: Kappa de chasa chama. If you do eat the poisonous element in the lettuce, chasa is the lettuce, or the worm, kappa is either the poisonous component or the worm in it, 2 different interpretations that were brought earlier in the Rashbam. Kappa de chasa, the remedy for the poison in the lettuce is chama, is to eat radish, to eat radishes. That will that will neutralize the damaging effects. Kappa de chama, but radishes can also have this acid. So the remedy for that is karte, to eat leeks. Leeks, right? Oh, yeah, leek. Yeah, karte is leeks. The kappa de karte, but that can also have some acid. So then chamimi, then drink warm water. And by the way, Rabbi says kappa de chulu. All of these poisonous elements, there's always a remedy of chamimi, of drinking warm water. I guess tea would be included in that. Drinking warm water, yeah. And the Gemara says now, adahachi v'hachi, in the meantime, till they bring you the warm water, and you're suffering from this, neimahachi, this is what you should say. Kappa kappa, poison, poison. The chirnalach, I remember you. Ulashav benosach, your 7 daughters. Ulasamne kalosach, and your 8 daughters-in-law. We have a few times in Gemara that there were different lechashim, different type of mantras and mystical, not very easy to understand statements that were made for different remedies of different situations. This is one of those lechashim, one of these mantras that were stated, that the Gemara had a tradition. It could be helpful for this type of poison, till they bring the warm water. Adahachi v'achi, poison, poison, I remember you, and I remember your 7 daughters and your 8 daughters-in-law. What the symbolism is, I don't know, because the Mefarshim don't explain it, but it's some type of remedy that the Gemara had a tradition, a verbal type of remedy that had its power. It's called lachash. Like these. I haven't seen. There's a sefer called Sefer HaAruch, and the Sefer HaAruch brings, he says that he doesn't have a commentary on this. He calls it Divrei Kabbalah, meaning it's a tradition. It was received, and it's a lachash. And he says it's like a lot of these kameyas, a lot of these amulets that are written, and these various mantras. He says we don't know the reason, we don't know where they come from, but they had some tradition and they have some power to them. That's what the Sefer Aruch brings here.
The other refuahs, they still work. This means they can still work today. I just wondered, because Gemara brings down a lot of refuahs with foods.
You say they don't work.
They don't work today.
Because the body's living.
Perhaps, yeah. One of the famous Rishonim in Ashkenaz was known as the Erzarua. The Erzarua in Hilchos Pesachim, he says that in his region where he lived, they had a minig to bake fresh matzah, not only the first night of Pesach, but also the second night of Pesach. You know, they would bake matzahs in the home. The commercial matzah bakeries didn't exist yet. Erev Pesach in the afternoon or close to the night of Pesach, or already at night, you could bake on Yom Tov. They would bake fresh matzah, everybody in their own house. That was the matzah that you ate. And he said we had a minig to bake fresh matzah even the second night of Pesach, even though you already had matzah and it didn't get ruined over one day. But there was a minig specially to do it. And he says the reason is because, based on this Gemara, very interesting. This is the Erzarua who lived in the 13th century, the 12th century. He says because the chazeres, the lettuce, has kappa, it has these poisonous components. And the Gemara says here that the remedy for all types of kappa, whether it's in the lettuce or in the radish or in the leeks, is what? Is chamimi, is the warm water. So he says right before the Seder, we baked the matzah so that the matzah was very, very hot. And we ate the matzah at the kairach together with the mar, and that would save us from all the problems. That's what the Erzarua brings, which is very, very interesting. So the Ramah in his Sefer Darchei Moshe in Chaim, he actually brings that from here you learn that it's good to have warm matzah, to keep the matzah warm and hot as a protector for the kappa. So it's just a very interesting minig based on this Gemara of much later generations. So we see from here that chamimi, right, that it's literally chamimi means like hot, yeah, hot. I mean, the Rashbam says kulu chamimi is mayim chamin. Mayim chamin is refuah lahem. That's why I translated it as water, because that's what the Rashbam says. Rashi also says chamimi yishtem mayim chamin. You should drink hot water. But we see from these Rishonim, there is a ruah held that heat itself, the heat component, was very helpful for it. So that would be the reason for the Charoses according to Tanakama. It's basically an issue of health. Once you're eating maror, it has to come with Charoses. The Charoses either neutralizes the acid or the poison, or it kills the worm that may exist in the lettuce. This doesn't mean every piece of maror has it. It means that it's possible it should exist, and even if it's only a minimal improbability, but since it's a probability, therefore the Chachamim obligated to have Charoses to avoid any type of hazard.
From a practical point of view,
Yes.
how can you have the same? Well, it was a meal the second. Okay, you could.
No, he lived in Chutz La'aretz. Dar Zarua didn't live in Eretz Yisrael. There were 2 Zdarim. Yeah, they had to do 2 Zdarim. Of course, in Eretz Yisrael, they didn't have to bake matzahs the second night. They didn't have an obligation to eat. Eretz Yisrael, you don't have to eat matzahs the second night. I mean, if you want, but you don't have to. It's Chalamayid. But in France, Germany...
Hot matzah for the Seder, you have to have it on the plate. You have to go through the Seder.
I guess warm. I don't think it was hot. It means warm. Huh? You mean if it was... No, he's saying you brought the matzah in the beginning of the Seder. By the time you get to eating the maror, it takes at least a half an hour, 45 minutes, and if people are speaking a lot...
Between the napkins.
So it's between the napkins, so the heat is retained. So I don't know how hot it was, but maybe, yeah, I mean, they covered it, so the heat... I guess they covered it right away, so the heat was retained more. But it obviously wasn't burning hot. It wasn't straight out of it couldn't be straight out of the oven because they brought the matzah in the beginning of the Seder. For Charoses? Well,
Why can't it be just a remes to...
no, because the Mishnah says you brought Charoses even though it's not a mitzvah. Rebbe Lazar, the son of Reb Tzadok, says it is a mitzvah. So the Gemara says, if it's not a mitzvah, why are you bringing it? Stop. We don't do things. So the first reason is that it's not a mitzvah, it's just a health concern. Now the Gemara is going to explain the second view. Rebbe Lazar, Reb Tzadok, I'm a mitzvah. Rebbe Lazar, the son of Reb Tzadok, says it is a mitzvah. The Gemara says, my mitzvah. What's the mitzvah? What's the mitzvah in Charoses? I know the mitzvah in Maror. I know the mitzvah in Matzah. I know the mitzvah in having the carbon Pesach. We know the mitzvah in wine. What's the mitzvah of Charoses? So Reb Levi says that the Chachamim instituted Charoses zecher l'tapuach. Fascinating. Charoses was made with apples as a commemoration of the apple trees. And the way the Rashi and the Rashbam explain it is that this is based on the very beautiful tradition that the Jewish women used to give birth to their children under apple trees. The Gemara says in Maseches Saita, Daf Yud Aleph, that the righteous women in Egypt obviously wanted to have children, but they knew that if they have males, those males will be cast into the Nile Delta. So basically, they had apple trees, and they used to go and hide under these apple trees and give birth under these apple trees far away from the evil eyes of the Egyptians who were looking for the new Jewish children. And God protected them under these apple trees where they would raise their children. That's what the Gemara says over there in Masechta Saita. And that's why it says in Hashirim, in chapter 8, Tachas hatapuach oirarticha. I have aroused you under the apple tree, Shama chibla yaldasach. Over there you had your birth pangs. Over there you gave birth. So this verse in the Song of Songs is paying testimony to this great event that happened under these apple trees. So Reb Levi holds that for this, the Chachamim made a special institution that on the night of Pesach, you should eat crushed up apples, which we call charoses, and you should take the maror and dip it in the charoses. The maror represents the subjugation, and the charoses represents the fact that despite the bitterness and despite the impossible circumstances, the women would not stop having the conviction and the faith to create a new generation of Jews. So that's already a whole different idea of the Charoses. The Charoses represents that conviction, that faith, the divine providence, even in these crazy, difficult, and unbearable circumstances, that they're ready to create a new generation. And it's very interesting because there's the famous Rashi in Parshas Vayakel, that the Iyar, the washing basin in the Mishkan, the pasuk says was made from what? It was made from the mirrors, the maris hatsoivos. It was donated by the women from the mirrors. Which mirrors? It's called maris hatsoivos, the mirrors that created the legions or the troops. So Rashi brings over there that men were so downtrodden and so dejected and so crushed from the slave labor, the last thing they were in the mood of was practicing normal family life. And the women had special mirrors that they used in order to adore them, to beautify themselves, to entice and trigger their husbands, and ultimately give birth to a new generation, known as Tzivos Hashem. The legions of God who left Egypt. So these women took these mirrors and they donated it to the Mishkan. to the tabernacle. And Moshe saw them, and Moshe knew what they were. And Moshe rejected them. As Rashi says, Moshe said, it's Asuyin Liyetzahara. These mirrors were made, to promote the physical arousal and desire. It doesn't belong in a holy place like the Mishkan. Amalei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Rashi says, Hashem told Moshe, take them. Elu chavivin alay min hakoil. This is more precious than anything else that was donated to the tabernacle, because it's these mirrors that allowed the Jewish people to continue, allowed a new generation to be created. And not only that, these mirrors became the washing basin through which the Kohanim would sanctify their hands and their feet every morning when they came into the Mishkan. In other words, the sanctity, the source of the sanctity of holiness came from the mirrors that they donated. And the uniqueness here was, as the Mefarshim explained, that they gave a lot of jewelry. That wasn't a big deal, but everything they gave was melted down into silver or gold and used silver, gold, copper. But here it wasn't melted down. The mirrors were left intact. When you looked at the washing basin, you saw mirrors, you saw yourself. If they would be melted down, it wouldn't have been an issue, because you transform them into a different type of material. It's the same material, but a completely different image. You melt it down and you shape it the way you want. Here the chiddush was that it was used as a mirror. So the idea of Reb Levi is that this is what the Charoses. The Charoses represents that commitment, that conviction, that faith, that divine providence of the apple tree. This makes it a mitzvah, not a biblical mitzvah. It doesn't say anywhere in Chumash to have Charoses, but it would be a rabbinic mitzvah like the other mitzvahs of the Seder, like 4 cups of wine, like reclining, like eating maror today when we don't have a carbon Pesach. One of them is also to eat Charoses, and you dip the maror in the Charoses.
The cure was enormous then, right?
Yes. That in this subjugation, it's like you take the maror, and the maror was dipped in these apples.
But if you take all the women that were of childbearing age, took all their mirrors, left them.
Oh. No, I guess not everybody brought their mirrors, and I guess if there were extra mirrors, they used it for other things. But the point is that the kiyur was made from these mirrors. I don't know how many mirrors. The mirrors were made out of copper, yeah. Nechoshes.
What you're saying, that they made the kiyur and lined it to the mirror, because how could we hold the water otherwise?
Even still, that's my question. It couldn't have been all the mirrors.
I assume the mirrors were pretty small. I assume they were tiny mirrors, so the kiyur probably was a combination of many of those mirrors. They were left intact, yeah. Yeah. Because one of them, I think it's the Even HaEzer, says, what's the big deal? They brought all types of things. It even says they brought kumas, and Rashi says, what's kumas? Kumas was a piece of jewelry that was placed in the most private place of a woman. So that is fine. That Moshe had no problem with. So he says, no, they melted everything down. What they melted it down. So what's the big deal with the mirrors? Because this is described as it remained mirrors. That's the chiddush. Now Hashem said this is more precious than everything else. Elu chavivin alay min hakoil. Very fascinating idea. This is what Rashi says. It's the exact opposite of what the Even HaEzer says. The Even HaEzer says the exact opposite interpretation. He says these were women who decided they don't want to have to do with the physical world anymore, and therefore they gave away their mirrors. The exact opposite, fascinating, exact opposite interpretation. He says they just wanted to pray and learn. That's what he says. Huh? Zeichel tapuach. Rabbi Yochanan says Zeichel tit. Actually, the Charoses is a commemoration to the clay, because it ultimately looks like clay or mortar or cement, which is basically earth mixed with water. It has that look. That's what the Charoses is. It was commemorating the tit, the clay with which the Jewish people were charged. It was part of the work. The major work was to build the structures for Parai and create tit, create cement, create mortar, plaster with the straw and the earth and the water that the Jewish people did. That is what the Charoses represents. So it's either the tapuach, the apple, or it's the tit, but the common denominator of both is that it's part of the rabbinic mitzvahs that are part of the Seder night, that you dip the maror into this Charoses, regardless if there's poison or not. It has nothing to do with necessarily. He may also agree that there was a health benefit. He's not denying it, That's not the discussion. It may not be an argument in that sense. There's a discussion about that. But the point is that there's an element called a mitzvah here. Amar Abaye said, because there are two opinions, hilchach therefore, tzarich lekahuye. You need to make sure the charosis is tarty. In other words, place in it apples which has that sour, tarty taste. V'tzarich l'samuche. And you also have to make sure that it's thick. You should put in enough ground food into it that it should have the thickness. Lekahuye, it should be tarty. Zeichel l'tapuach, because Rabbi Levi teaches us it commemorates the apple tree. V'tzarich l'samuche, it should have a thickness to it. Zeichel l'tit, because Rabbi Yochanan tells us that it commemorates the clay. So therefore, you should have both components in the charosis. A very interesting idea is that the Rambam in Hilchas Chametz Matzah Perek Zayin says that even the matzah you have to dip into charosis. The Rambam holds that even today's day, he writes clearly, in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, they dip the matzah into the charosis, but he says even today you take the matzah and you dip it in charosis, and that's how you eat it. Just like the morah we dip in charosis because zeichel tapuach, zeichel tit, the matzah also we dip into charosis and we eat it. That is the view of the Rambam. So when the Gemara says here charosis is a mitzvah, according to the Belazar, based on the Mishnah that it's a mitzvah, the Rambam says if it's a mitzvah, it's not only for the morah, it's also for the matzah. You dip the matzah in charosis and you eat it. The Ravid says on those words of the Rambam, zehevel. This is vanity. That's his expression on these words of the Rambam, zehevel, to dip the matzah into charosis. Just a very fascinating argument.
He wasn't worried about the liquid.
Huh?
He wasn't worried about the liquid.
You mean the gebrukt? The wine. The wine, it's not water.
But is that the reason why we dip it and shake it off and don't eat?
Yeah, so we shake it off, as the Gemara says earlier, because the taste, right? Because you want the taste of, you don't want it to completely neutralize the taste of the mortar.
But it would go also. You said some say you shouldn't eat.
So it's very interesting. The Rogatchover, the Rabbi Yosef Rosen, in his Sefer Tzafnas Paneach on the Rambam, he says a very interesting insight. What the argument between the Rambam and the Ravid is. The Ravid says zehevel, it's vanity, zehevel. So he says that the Rambam says twice you have to dip the matzah in charosis. One is when he describes the Seder in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, and one is when he describes the Seder today. The first time, at the time of the Beis Hamikdash, the Ravid doesn't argue with them. Which means that according to the Rogatchover, everybody holds that at the time of the Beis Hamikdash, they would dip matzah in charosis. The question is about today. This is where the Ravid gets very upset. He explains why, what's the logic. The answer is because matzah has two components to it. Matzah is unique. Morer is zeichel shibu. The reason we eat morer is because of bitterness. It's for the subjugation. Right? The charosis we see here is zeichel tit. It's because of the clay which the Jewish people were enslaved and had to build and make for Paray. Make and then build the structures of Paray. Even Zeichel Tapuach, the apple tree, they had to run away to the apple tree because of the danger of giving birth in their homes, because the kids would be killed. So he says the Morah and the Charosis represent the elements of subjugation. Matzah has a dual identity. On one hand, we say matzah is lechem oini. We learned before that matzah is the bread of, it's the bread of poverty, right? Lechem oini. That's why we use a broken piece. It's the bread of poverty. It represents the poor man's bread. On the other hand, we eat matzah because they didn't have time to let the dough ferment, because they were chased out of Mitzrayim. So there's an element of geula. There's an element of geula in matzah. Now we see something very interesting, and that is matzah, even today, is biblical. Matzah bezman hazeh, but today is biblical. Morer today is rabbinic. There's no mitzvah of morer today. Min HaTorah, because morer, it says you can all eat with the Korban Pesach. Today the rabbis, so the Rogatchover says, what does this mean? This means that in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, there was a mitzvah to eat matzah and there was a mitzvah to eat morer. Today, biblically, there's no mitzvah to eat morer anymore. Because what's morer? Morer is zecher la'avdus. Morer is to remember the slavery. So in the time of redemption, they remember the slavery. But min HaTorah today, you don't have to remember the slavery. So you don't have to eat morer today, Seder. Okay? The Chachamim said you should still eat morer, but min HaTorah you don't eat morer. Matzah you still eat. Why? He says because matzah is not only for the enslavement, matzah is also for the geula. So it's in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, when matzah had a dual identity, of course you dip it in charosis, because charosis also represents the enslavement. But bizman hazeh, when we eat matzah min haTorah, and it's not zeichel avdus, this is only zeichel lecherus, because the maror we don't eat today, because maror is only avdus, so we don't eat maror today. So the matzah also lost that element. So he says there's no place to dip matzah in charoses, because matzah represents liberation and charoses represents subjugation. So the matzah remains divorced from the charoses. The question is, and this is what the Rambam holds, can the rabbis institute something today that you're anyway doing min haTorah with a new reason? Just like they institute to eat maror for slavery, even though it's not min haTorah, can you say that they instituted to eat matzah zeichel avdus when you already have a mitzvah min haTorah? The Ravid says absolutely not, and therefore there's no reason to dip it in the charoses. The Rambam holds, yeah, and therefore he shows that even today you dip the matzah in the charoses, but in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, everybody would hold that you dip the matzah into the charoses. But this is a great chiddush of the Rambam, that even today you dip the matzah in charoses. We don't do it because most of the poskim disagree with the Rambam, beginning with the Ravid. Tanya Kavasei Rabbi Yochanan. We have a brisa that supports Rabbi Yochanan, who says that it's for the clay, for the cement, for the tit. The brisa tells us tavlin. You should mix into your charoses different types of spices, zecher leteven, different types of spices that will look like straw, as a commemoration for the teven, for the straw that the Jewish people needed to collect in order to mix in to the mud to turn it into clay. Because the way they made bricks was, how they make bricks. They had to take straw and mud, earth and water, and bring straw and then make the molds and bake it in the sun or in a furnace. So zecher leteven, you should bring in also different spices that look like it. And the charoses, the brisa says, and the charoses itself is zecher letit, is a commemoration for the clay. This is a clear support to Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Rebbe Lazar, Rebbe Tzadok, Rebbe Lazar, the son of Rebbe Tzadok, said, Kacha yu oimrim tagore charachsha b'Yerushalayim. Let me tell you what the window vendors in Jerusalem used to say. Tagore are merchants, like people who have stores, businessmen. Charach is windows through which you look out. It was window vendors. We have the expression meitzitz min hacharakim, right? He looks out from the cracks, from the peepholes, from the openings. So tagore charach were the window vendors in Jerusalem. This is what they used to say. Boyu utlulachem tavlin mitzvah. They would announce, they would say, come buy spices for the mitzvah. In other words, they called charoses a mitzvah, which is Rebbe Lazar was trying to vindicate his position that it's not just a health hazard not to have charoses, but it's actually a mitzvah, and his proof was from the window vendors of Jerusalem who used to call it a mitzvah, and therefore he tainas that it is a mitzvah.
Why would you use the selling argument?
I guess the fact that it became entrenched in the language of the window vendors meant that the tradition by the Jewish people was that charoses was a mitzvah. I saw that, there's a Tosefta Masechta Beitz, a Pera Gimel, a Tosefta in Beitz, and it says, they said on Rebbe Lazar ben Reb Tzadok and Abba ben Shaul, that Shahayu Chenvenim b'Yerushalayim kol yemei chayehim. Rebbe Lazar wasn't just talking about other people, he himself was a storekeeper. He's one of the Tanoim, but he himself had a store his whole life. That was his business. He had a chenveni in Yerushalayim. He was a storekeeper, and he lived in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, and the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed in his days. So when he's talking about the window vendors, he's talking about his colleagues. You see, he wasn't just saying, he walked by and he heard them say. These were his colleagues. I saw they bring from the Meiri, the Masifta brings it, the Meiri says that the reason they used windows was only on Erev Pesach, because Erev Pesach, most people didn't do work, and in Yerushalayim, certainly, they didn't do malach on Erev Pesach. So therefore, they didn't have their stores open. They just had at night, sometimes you go lahavdil to gas stations. You can't go into the store. They just have a window. So Erev Pesach, the store wasn't open. They just had a window, and they used it. They used it for things that you had to sell for Yom Tov. He says that's why there were window vendors.
So this is Rabbi Lazar bar Tzadok.
The same man, Rebbe Lazar bar Tzadok, is proving his position that charoses is a mitzvah from the window vendors in Jerusalem who used to announce, come buy spices for your mitzvah, for your charoses. Because in the charoses you put fruits, you put like apples and other fruits, you put pears or almonds and so forth. And then they used to put some spices also.
Are these
Ginger and cinnamon.
Ginger and cinnamon, yeah. Those people who use it still, yeah. Huh? Some don't use these spices, they don't. But originally that was the takana, to put fruits and to put spices. Like ginger and cinnamon, yeah.
So where there's the discussion of taking off the window frames and using them to sell.
Right.
It's the same window.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So that would be the same. It was on Daf Gimel. You said it's a Tosefta, and not the Tosfos. It's in the Tosfos.
Tosefta Beitz Peir Gimel identifies Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok and Abba Shaul as people who were storekeepers their entire lives in Jerusalem. And this was in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, the end of the second Beis HaMikdash, they had a store. On a more homiletical level, I saw that the Pnei Menachem, not the present Ger Rebbe, but the previous Ger Rebbe, Reb Pinchas Menachem Alter, says that it's a little strange that Rabbi Elazar brings the store vendors in Jerusalem as a source that it's a mitzvah. I mean, on a literal level, it's like what the Gemara says earlier in Pesachim, Hanach lehen li Yisrael im eina neviim hein, bnei neviim hein. That Jews, sometimes in Jewish culture, there are things that, it says, even if they're not prophets, they're children of prophets. So when they do something or they say something, there's something there. Don't dismiss it. So probably that's what he means, that the window vendors, they know, like you want to know the truth, go to the window vendors. You don't always have to go to the Beis Medrash. You have to see what they say in the marketplace, because they just have like a certain element of tradition, so all the arguments could be clarified. He says on a more homiletical level, he says that it says, what's the Lashon? Mashgiach min kol doidi hine zeba medalag al har makapetz al agvoyes. Mashgiach min hachaloinos meitzitz min hacharakim. That God looks through the windows and he peeks through the charakim. Charakim are like little lattice work. Yeah, charakim are like little cracks, like in the door. You have the peephole. You look through it, the other person can't see you. So mashgiach min hachaloin is when you look through the window, you could see, I'm looking through the window, you see me, I see you. Meitzitz min hacharakim, when you look through that little crack, I see you, but you don't see me. So he says that in the time of Galus, in the time of exile, it's the pchin of meitzitz min hacharakim, that God's providence is there, but you sometimes don't see it, because it's anoichi aster, it's concealed. So the Charoses represents, as Reb Levi said, that they had an apple tree, that even in the subjugation of Egypt, they didn't lose their faith. They went to give birth under the apple tree. So he says that's the remez, that the window vendors in Jerusalem understood that even in the time of the Churban, he lived in the time of the Churban, there is still the charakim, there is still the hashgacha, even in the time of subjugation, and that's what the Charoses represents. That's what he says. The remez is that in Jerusalem, the window vendors represents the fact that they understood that God is still looking through the window and giving providence for the Jewish people. Zok the Mishnah weiter. The Mishnah spoke about the first cup of wine. Then it spoke about bringing the kaira, the karpas, and bringing the matzah, and the chazeres, and the charoses, and the two dishes, and the sheep or the lamb in the time of the Beis HaMikdash. This is done. What happens now? Mazguloi kois sheni. You pour now the second of the 4 cups of wine of the night of the Seder. And it's called mazgu because they used to dilute. Mazgu means they used to pour and dilute the wine with water. Even though you're not drinking this cup now because you still have to say the Haggada. But as we know, you fill up the second cup right now before you start saying the Haggada. V'kan haben shoyel aviv. And here is where the son asks his father. He asks his father. And as Rashi explains, what's the question? The question is, why are we pouring a second cup of wine if we're not eating yet? They didn't wash yet. You didn't eat yet. You didn't start eating. Usually you drink wine in the middle of the meal. Here you pour a cup of wine and you're not eating yet and you're not drinking it yet. You're going to drink it only after the Haggada. So that's the first question that the child asks the father, and that's why you pour the cup of wine right now. V'im ein das baben. If the child doesn't have the das, the awareness, the sophistication, the knowledge to ask these types of questions, aviv melamdai, his father teaches him to ask the question. If the child is wise enough to ask the question on himself, by himself, why did you pour the second cup? So Rashi and the Rashbam explain, that's enough. You don't even have to ask anything else. You could move on with the Seder. However, if the child doesn't have das, then the father teaches him to ask the question. And here the Mishnah introduces what are the questions the father teaches the child to ask. What makes this night different than all other nights? You remember this? All the nights you eat chametz and matzah, tonight only matzah. All the nights we eat various vegetables. Tonight we eat maror. Now before he said kulei matzah, he doesn't say kulei maror, because we're not only eating maror tonight. We just had karpas. Karpas could be potato or onions or other vegetables, but we eat maror tonight. Where matzah, it's not like we eat also matzah. We eat only matzah. We don't eat chametz. That's why by matzah it says kulei, by maror it just says maror. The third question is on oichlin basar. All the nights we eat meat any way we like. Tzli, you can roast it, you can have a barbecue. Shaluk, you can cook it very well. Mevushal, well done. Mevushal, you could cook it in the ordinary fashion. Shaluk means it's cooked for a long time. You can eat as you want. Halayla zeh, tonight, kuloi tzli. The meat that we eat is completely roasted because the Torah obligates us. V'achlos habasar b'layla zeh tzli, right? You have to take the sheep or the lamb and roast it in the fire. You're not allowed to cook it in a pot. You don't bake it in an oven. You put it in the fire itself with a spit. It has to be tzli. Alayla zeh kuloi tzli. It's completely tzli this night. Which also follows the shitta of Ben Tema that the second carbon that they brought often on Erev Pesach, which was the carbon Chagiga, also has to be roasted. That's why he says, going to say, kuloi tzli. Now, obviously, we don't say this question today. Right here, it's interesting. We see a new question that we don't say because we don't have kuloi tzli. This only applied to the time of the Beis Hamikdash. The Mishnah here is recording the ideal Seder. In the ideal Seder, the child asked this question. But today, you can't ask this question because actually we're going to eat chicken or we're going to eat meat and it's not going to be roasted on fire. It's going to be cooked or baked or sautéed, however you make it, but it's not going to be tzli. So this is very fascinating that this question does not apply today. In fact, our minhag today is that we don't even eat roasted meat in the night of Pesach. So actually, not only we don't say it because we don't have to, but according to the minhag, we don't even do it. It's inappropriate to eat tzli. So this question was deleted. The last question is Shabachal Aleilas Anu Matbilin Pamachas Alayla Zeshtei Pamim. The Gemara is going to make a correction here, but the way we read it now is Shabachal Aleilas Anu. There's different girses here, but let's read Anu Matbilin Pamachas. All the nights we dip once. Alayla Zeshtei Pamim. Tonight we dip vegetables twice, karpas, and then maror we're going to dip again. So we had here 4 questions: chametz matzah, maror, roasted meat, and finally the dipping. Those are the 4 questions. The interesting thing is that nowadays, this is what the Vilna Gaon writes in his Haggada. Nowadays, after the Churban of the Beis Hamikdash, we took out this question and we replaced it with another question. Which question? Haseba, reclining, which the Mishnah doesn't mention. The Vilna Gaon here has a very fascinating chap. And he says that in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, and even in the time of the Mishnah, they couldn't ask that question because they always used to recline. They reclined all year. Slaves didn't recline. People who were eating on the run didn't recline. But a regular prominent person reclined. So he's not going to say manishtana. Doesn't make sense. No, all nights of the year they would eat mesubin. So he says that wouldn't apply in the time of the Beis Hamikdash. But in later generations when reclining went out of style, like today nobody reclines, so you could say, Manishtana Laila Zeh Mikol HaLeilos. That's the interpretation of the Vilna Gaon in his Haggada. The problem with this is, according to the Rambam in Hilchas Chametz Matzah describes the Seder in the time of the Beis Hamikdash and the questions they asked, and he puts 5 questions in the time of the Beis Hamikdash. One is the roasted meat, the carbon Pesach, and also the question of Haseba. So it's obvious that according to the Rambam, he believes that the question of Haseba was even in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, because there's an obligation for everybody to recline, where other nights it's not an obligation. You could not. So he says clearly that in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, they also had the question of Haseba.
I don't understand. Murder was definitely enough to have something.
The Mishnah. This is the Mishnah.
Mishnah was
Yes, of course. The Mishnah was written after the Churban.
It's already, they should have him in Hogim of reclining.
No, so the Vilna Gaon says that even in the time of the Mishnah, reclining didn't stop right after the Churban Beis HaMikdash. It continued for hundreds of years later. So even then, the Mishnah wouldn't incorporate it. That's his opinion.
So it's not the similar of if there is Beis HaMikdash or not.
Right, yeah, no. It continued for many years later. He says, at some point, the first Haggada that we have, the text of the Haggada that we have, even though a lot of the text of the Haggada we have in Mishnah, and we have in Sifri, which is even before the Mishnah, or it's around the period of the Mishnah, but the most text of the majority of the Haggada that was formulated as our Haggada is only for much later generations. Time of the Gaonim, we have the Haggada of Reb Amram Gaon, the manuscript in British Museum. So that's already, you're dealing with the 800s, the 900s, the 1000s. No, they had the Haggada, but I'm saying our text of the Haggada fully formulated in such an organization, we have only from later, but it originates already in the time of the Mishnah, and even before the time of the Mishnah. We'll soon see that there's a lot of things we'll say, direct quotes from the Mishnah. So there's no question. I'm just saying the Vilna Gaon says that this question was only added later as a substitute to the fourth question that they had to delete after the Churban.
Do we have a record of which something established the text of Haggada?
No, not that I ever saw.
What was the substitution again? Fourth question.
In other words, at some point, when they stopped eating with Haseba a whole year, the Vilna Gaon says they decided, you know what, let's put this in as the fourth question. It's a very good question. But I'm just saying, when you look in the Rambam, Hilchas Chametz Hamatz, it's clear that in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, they asked all 5 questions.
And then in the Rashbam, where the first Rashbam, the second, mixing the second cup.
Yes.
So what's the reference to Benos Suachad? Why did we bring them in?
Oh. So the Mishnah started off, Mazguloi Kaisheni v'kan haben shoyelis aviv. Here the son asks. What does it mean here? What does it mean here? Like not later, not earlier. So the Rashbam says, Kan, the first Rashbam on the Mishnah, Kan b'mezigas kaisheni. You pour the second cup. Now haben shoyelis aviv. Im hu chachem manishtana. Achshav shemoizgin kaisheni kaidem achila. Because now there's a big question. Why are you pouring a second cup of wine when you're not going to drink it? Because we're not going to drink this wine until much later when we finish much of the Haggada. So that's the kan. This is the place to ask. And that's the reason we're filling up the cup of wine, to trigger arousal. But that's only if the child is attentive and conscientious and is aware. And if not, the Mishnah says, then you have to tell him what to ask. It says, V'Rabbeinu kibel mi Rabbi Yaakov ben Yakar.
Rabbeinu is Rabbeinu HaKodesh?
No, Rabbeinu is Rashi, the Rashbam's grandfather. Our Rebbe Rashi, his Rebbe, our teacher Rashi. Rashbam was a grandson of Rashi who sat with him and learned by him, so he calls him Rabbeinu. Says he received from his Rebbe. Rashi had a Rebbe named Rabbi Yaakov, the son of Rabbi Yakar. So he says not v'kan haben shoyel, but v'chein haben shoyel. What does that mean? V'chein haben shoyel. What's v'chein haben shoyel? V'chein literally means likewise. What's the likewise? So he says, Kimoi kain b'noi slavchat. The kain here means something else. When the daughters of Slavchat come to Moshe at the end of the 40 years, right, in Parshas Pinchas, and they say, Lama Nigara, why should we lose? Our father Slavchat died. He had no sons. Only sons are inheritors of the properties, the assets of the parent, of the father. We're going to go into Eretz Yisrael, we're not going to have anything. And they weren't married either at the time. They weren't married. So we're going to have nothing. It's not fair. So Moshe goes to Hashem, and Hashem says, Kain b'noi slavcha doivras. What does Kain b'noi slavcha? So Rashi says Kain from the word like kiyor v'kanoi. There is a basis to what the daughters of Slavcha are saying. Kain b'noi slavcha doivras. They're saying something right. Like you say Kainim, it's true, it's authentic. They're saying something right. There's a basis to it. Basis in Hebrew is kan. A kan is a basis. Kiyor v'chanoi, the basis of the kiyor. In other words, they're saying something right. Like Cain is, it's right, it's true, it's emes. Cain b'nai slavcha doivros. So he says, Kaloimar, dinu sheyeh shol b'mezigas hakos manishtan. V'chein haben shoyel. It's the right thing now for the child to ask. Like Cain b'nai slavcha, it's the right thing. for the child now to ask the question. That's what Rashi heard from Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Yakar, not V'chana ben Shaul, but V'kena ben Shaul.
Child, that's the question. Why did Hashem didn't answer? Don't worry, you will get married, you will have a chelik also.
Because the answer of Hashem was not that they'll get married, they'll have a chelik. The answer was that if there's no sons, the daughters actually get it. So it's much more than that, even before they got married. It was a din in Nachala, a new din in Yerusha, that if there's no sons, the daughters get it, even if they're not married. If they're married, they also get it.
It was not particularly easy.
Right. Later they happened to get married. And they actually had to marry in their own tribe, Menashe.
That was again just for that generation.
Exactly, only for that generation, because their tribe came to complain and said they're going to get married, and all the territory is going to go over to their husbands and their children, who are going to be from another tribe. They might be from another. So he said they should marry from their own tribe. They should choose whoever they want, but it should be that. But that was only for that generation.
That's the Gemara about Basra.
Yeah. So that's the Cain haben Shayel. So according to this, according to the Rashi and Rashbam, it's clear that if the child asks about the cup, you can go straight to Avadim Hayinu. If the child doesn't have das, then the father teaches him to ask Manishtana, because you need to have questions and answers. So if the child asks on his own, you're good. If not, teach your child to ask Manishtana Laila Zemikala Leilis, and let him ask, and then you can move on with the Seder, because there has to be the element of questions and answers. This is the shit of Rashi and Rashbam who hold that you don't have to ask the Manishtana, you just need a question. If the child asked a question, you could move on. I should just add that earlier in the Gemara on Kuf Tesvav, Tosfos argued with this proposition, and Tosfos says that even if the child asks his own questions, he still has to ask the Manishtana, because this is what the Chachamim established. So according to Tosfos, the way you have to read the Mishnah is Mazgu loy kais sheni, v'kan haben shoyel the Manishtana, and if the child doesn't ask on his own, then teach him the Manishtana. So it's two ways of interpreting the Mishnah. Does the child actually have to ask the Manishtana always? That's the view of Tosfos. The view of Rashi and Rashbam is no. If the child asked on his own, you could just move on and skip the Manishtana. Which would explain why the Manishtana, because according to the Rambam, obviously there was the question of Haseba. Also, because he puts it into the time of the Beis HaMikdash, but it's not in the Mishnah. Now the Rambam didn't make up his own question for the time of the Beis HaMikdash. He can't do that. The Rambam would have, so obviously the Rambam had a text where it said the question of a Seba, but it doesn't say in our Mishnah. So either the Rambam had a different version, or a different medrash, or a different source that we don't have in the Chazal, that they used to ask in the time of the Beis HaMikdash the question of a Seba, not like the Vilna Gaon. He had that text. Or you could say that there was actually a time when there was no inherent text, meaning based on Rashi and the Rashbam, it makes sense because the Manishtana is not a real obligation. It's just based on every child. So you could feed any question to the child. So that's why different children asked different things. And there was no uniform text. And then at some point, they brought it all together. And they made a system. But originally, the system was not inherent because it was more of a voluntary basis just to ask questions. So you could be yoitze with different questions. And that would explain why the Mishnah deletes a seba, even though the question was asked. Because at some point they did bring them together. There should be a uniform system. It's like by Tkiyas, it says that according to many, you could do Tkiya, Shvarim, you could do Trua, you could do Shvarim Trua, but then at the end they just made one system, so there shouldn't be different Haggada.
If child asks the question, is that the one way we call him the Chuchum Manishtana? Or it's a different
Yeah. The reason you call him a Chacham of the Manishtana is, I think, this Mishnah. Because if he's a Chacham, he asked it on his own. On his own, yeah. That's where the expression came, a Chacham from the Manishtana. He asked it on his own.
When the Mishnah said Tzli would stop after the Churban,
yeah, after we can't say anymore.
After the Churban, so why did the Mishnah put in Tzli?
No, the Mishnah is written after the Churban, but the Mishnah is recording the way they did it in the time of the Beis HaMikdash. Just like in the previous Mishnah, it said that by the Beis HaMikdash they used to bring a sheep to the table. The Mishnah is recording Jewish history and Jewish law in its ideal form, not only the way it's now.
We took it out, so
We had to take it out.
we're recording what happened.
In the time of the Mishnah, they also had to take it out, but the Mishnah is writing the way it was ideally. Just like in the previous Mishnah, it says that in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, right, they would bring the sheep for the Karban Pesach. So he's talking about the time of the Beis HaMikdash. They would actually bring, so here too he's talking about the time of the Beis HaMikdash. And the bulk of it remains, but this detail had to be deleted. Ulefi daiter shel ben aviv melamdoi. And the father should teach the child according to his das, according to his capacity, according to his comprehension. Meaning, the answer to these questions should not be uniform. It should be tailor-made to your child. Mamalei kalalman, right? You have to tailor the answer to him. So don't just answer the same answer to all children. It's based on his das, based on his asaga. How do you tell the story? Says the Mishnah, Maschil bignus u'mesayim b'shvach. You don't just begin by telling the good parts. Maschil bignus. You begin with the disgrace. You talk about the challenge, the struggle, the darkness, and then you conclude with the praise, with the salvation, with the redemption. This is the foundation of how the Haggada is created. Maschil bignus u'mesayim b'shvach. In other words, that redemption of Egypt is always, you're not just redeemed, you're redeemed from a place of darkness. The idea of Yetzias Mitzrayim is not that there's no struggle, there's no subjugation, there's no bitterness. It's just all dandy and sweet and good. The idea is, no, it begins with challenge, it begins with gnus, it begins with disgrace, it begins with humiliation, and it concludes with redemption. That's the whole idea of Yetzias Mitzrayim. That's what you're telling the child. Maschil b'gnus u'mesayim b'shvach. You're not telling the child that life is about liberation and emancipation without struggle, that everything comes easy, that everything is sweet. You tell the child that we have the capacity for transformation. We always have the capacity for renewal. That's the foundation of the Haggada. It's very fascinating that what the Chazal felt, that has to be the message. Don't just talk about the good stuff. Talk about the journey towards redemption, right? V'doirish me'arami oivid avi at sheyigmer kol haparsha kula. And the way you tell the story to your child is, we're going to expound a particular verse in Chumash, the verse that begins with Arami oivid avi, which is basically Parshas Kisavai, when you bring your basket of new fruits called bikurim. So the pasuk says you had to make a declaration to the Kohen in the Beis Hamikdash, to Hashem. V'anisa v'amarti l'fnei Hashem elakecha. When you brought your bikurim, your new fruits to the Kohen in Yerushalayim, right? Every year after you had new fruits, you brought the bikurim, and there's a whole declaration in Parshas Kisavei. And what did you say? Arami oived avi, the man from Arami tried to destroy my father. Vayered Mitzrayim, my father went down to Egypt. Vayagar Sham, and he lived there. B'mesei ma'at, with a very small group. Vayihi Sham l'goy gadol atzum varav, and he developed into a big, strong, and great nation. And we continue about the affliction and the enslavement and the cry of the Jewish people. And that's the Parsha. Those are the verses that we're going to read in the Haggada and expound on those verses. And this line in the Mishnah becomes the basis of the Haggada. Once we finish Vihisha Amda, right, what do? Tseil mad ma bikesh lovan harami lasas leYaakov Avinu shenemar Arami oivid avi, and then the rest of the Haggada till we get to Reb Gamliel, till the last piece where we're going to drink the wine. What is it? People don't often realize. The structure is very intricate. It goes through those verses, quotes a verse, expounds on it, like he says, Doirish explains it, and in that small verse, in that small few verses, you have the story. Because it's interesting. If I were to tell you, I want you to compose, if Moshe comes and says, every year Pesach, we have to tell the story to our children, and I choose you to write the text, which text would you use? You need a text to read in order to tell the story. What do you think would be the logical text to use? What would you choose? Huh? I'm saying which text? If you had to choose a text to read. So which Parshas would you choose? L'cha'ira, you should sit down, read Parshas Shmois, Parshas Va'era, Parshas Bo, and you're done. You have the whole story. We don't mention any of that. Just do the story. Read the story. You have a beautiful story. A sad story, a happy story. Go through. We don't do that. We choose a few verses from Parshas Kisavai, right? Literally, mamash a few 2-3 verses. Mamash 2-3 verses where we have the whole story compressed, mamash in miniature form. Arami Ovedavi Vayagar Shom Vayareyo Esanu Hamitzrim Vayanunu Vayitna Aleinu Avoida Kasha Vanitzak El Hashem Alakei Aviseinu Vayishma Eskalenu Vayasenenu V'Samleinu V'Slachatzenu Vayetzienu Mitzrayim B'Yod Chazaka U'Bizroya Natuya. We take those few words, and that becomes the text, and that's what we expound on. It's very interesting. We don't use the original text of the story. What do you think the reason for that is? But you see, that's what he says. V'doirish me'arami ovid avi at sheyigmer kol ha'parsha kula. You take that parsha from Bikurim, the very small, miniature version of Jewish history, literally in a few seconds. Those verses take a few seconds. And that's what you expound. And that becomes the basis of the text of the Haggada. That you finish this parsha that deals with Yetzias Mitzrayim, and you're good. Isn't that interesting? What do you think the reason for that is? You never thought about this, right? But if anybody here had to choose the text of the Haggada, you would have chosen another text. Like we don't even do the 10 plagues the way that says in Chumash. We say Davar Acher b'Yod Chazaka Shtayim, and this is Shtayim, and that Shtayim, and it comes out to 10 plagues.
Actually, it's a miniature story.
It's mamash the story contained in a few verses, the whole story, and then we expound on that story and we show how every word really contains the whole long story in Shmais Veda. But we don't do the long story. We do the short story, and from there we expound on the long stories. It's very fascinating about the structure of the Haggada. Your child never asked you this question. Huh? This is the best question. This is the best question.
You used to tell us that when you tell a story, tell them what you can tell, and then tell them what you just told, right? It's different.
So I saw the Malbim says, I don't have a clear answer to this. I'm just telling you, I'm bringing up the question. But we see clearly the Mishnah is telling us the structure. Don't go to Shmois V'Ei Rabbi. I want you to go to Parshas Kisavai, which is not the story. It's over there. It's a mitzvah. A Jew brings Bikurim, and incidentally, when you bring Bikurim, you have to thank God. And when you thank God, you go through Jewish history. So one way of understanding it is because actually that's the way the Torah repeats the story at a later generation. When you're bringing Bikurim, that's how you repeat the story. So on Pesach, we're repeating the story, so we go to that parsha that does the repetition, not the original story. That's one way of looking at it. The Malbim says it's actually based on the fact that the whole idea is to teach it to the child. So the Torah says you don't always have to do an hour-long story. Sometimes it's 10 seconds. The whole story you have to know, and I think that's a very powerful idea. It's a very powerful idea, you know. Giving over the tradition is not long lectures. Look who's talking. Huh? Sometimes you lose the person. Yeah. Okay.
The story of Moshe you told us about the Rabbi Levi.
Yeah, exactly. You take the story. That's what the Torah does over there. The 2-3 psukim, and you have it all. And the point is, you have it all, and that's what the Haggada shows you. The Haggada says if you analyze each word, Vanitzak, Vayar, Onyenu, Amalenu, Lachatzenu, Goy, Gadol, if you take every word, ultimately, you can unravel the word and you'll have it all there. And that's the idea we learned in the Maimah V'Yadaita Tafresh Nun Zayin. The Gemara says, La'olam yishna adam l'tamida b'derech tzara. You should always teach b'kitzer that in the kitzer, in the brevity, you have to have everything. Everything should be there. But it's in a way that's compact and presentable. So since the Haggada is about the child, so the Malbim says you do it very, very brief. And that's the whole idea. You could put it into the briefest way. Some children, you can unravel it. Some children don't unravel it. Just give it that way. It's a very powerful idea, I think, for education.
It's a PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah.
It's almost the opposite of the Megillah.
The Megillah, you're saying, is the opposite.
Think about something long as the Megillah.
Right.
But it says that about it, even though it takes longer.
Longer than the Megillah. Longer than the Megillah. But it's fascinating. People don't ask the question, why would the Chazal not choose the text that God wrote? You have a text. It's really a very powerful question.
Say God told us his story, now you tell you.
Yeah, the whole story is written up beautifully. It's one of the longest stories in Chumash. 3 portions. Shmois V'Ei Rabbi. Just sit down and tell the story. 10 plagues. You have it all here. No, we're deducing the 10 plagues from B'Yod Chazaka, Meir Gadol. Ganz interessant.
Seems harder for the children to understand that way.
Perhaps, right? He's saying it's harder. Here you could do a whole show. Like, if you realize in the Haggada, when we say the 10 plagues, we don't say it as part of the story. We say it as part of the dirash in the psukim of Parshas Kisava. We're deducing it from the verses in Kisava. We don't say it in a direct fashion.
Maybe if you say too much, they won't have nothing to ask anymore. You want them to ask. So you explain everything, there's nothing left.
I hear you. Okay. Pesach is interesting even after Pesach.
I was reading a Torah in English during Pesach, and the first line it says, the Vilna Gaon said that one of the hardest things is to be b'simcha all through Yom Tov. So I figured out why you said that.
You know, many Haggadahs at the end of the Seder says Chasal Siddur Pesach, right? There's a whole song, Chasal Siddur Pesach. The Baal HaTanya, the Alter Rebbe, in his Haggadah, he didn't put in Chasal Siddur Pesach. So it says, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe said, because the Alter Rebbe wanted to say, as Pesach endigt sich nicht. Chasal Siddur Pesach means the Seder is over. He was saying it doesn't end. The light of Pesach always continues. So Mamish in the Haggada, he deleted Chasal Siddur Pesach.
This class is brought to you by theyeshiva.net. Please help us continue the classes. Make even a small contribution at www.theyeshiva.net/donate.